happy to take questions. Yeah, so I think with the Montreal Protocol and ozone depleting substances, you're absolutely right. We did manage a regime to do that, although I think it was a lot easier because there's a lot less vested interest compared to what we have at the moment with climate change and coal companies and the like. And so that's a real challenge. But yes, it's a good model. And the truth is, I mean, I think there are different cultural approaches to this. So, countries like Germany, which are rapidly phasing out coal and have, been pushing that, have a different sort of perspective to maybe, in Australia. And even, I think Lewis has made an interesting comment there, which is true, is that WA is an aspirational target. And, we have this sort of, and someone else made a comment about the LNP and they're very right. We have this challenge in Australia at the moment where I think really as a result of the last federal election where the seats that basically won the coalition election were all around Adani and those coal sectors, there's a view from the right that the only way to control this is to have coal and fracking and opening up more gas. There are others that are pushing back against that very hard. And the COVID Commission, out of the COVID Commission came a lot of also push for fracking and gas. But the fact is that globally around the world, and then finally in Australia, everybody keeps calling gas a clean fuel, whereas actually, in fact, gas is a fossil fuel. It's not a clean fuel. Let's be very clear about this. It produces exceedingly high levels of greenhouse gas emissions and methane. And in some cases, that's almost on par with coal, along with all the other damages that fracking does. And in America, the entire industry has collapsed as well, the fracking industry. And as we move ahead in other areas, that will be left behind. But I think a lot of this is about getting the message out and getting people to understand, when you're told that gas is a great transition clean fuel, but actually coming out the other end and say, well, actually, no, it's not, it's a fossil fuel. Yeah, so sorry, I wasn't saying that we shouldn't be focused on states. I was saying because the states are moving so well, they should get up support, and we should support that action. But if you want to change, if you want to lobby in a different way, the federal government need to be pushed. I think basically what will actually happen is that if we get more independent candidates in seats that, like particularly in Melbourne, where we did last time, it has the Zali-Steggall effect, then the weight within the government will shift more towards a concern on doing something on climate to do that. So I think that's definitely the case. So sorry, your other comment about, I think Beyond Net Zero Emissions and Climate Council are doing a fantastic job. I'm on the board of Climate Council, so I hope they're doing a good job. But I just think that you have on the one side incredibly powerful the Minerals Council, the Resource Lobby, gas companies, coal companies against basically the environmental groups that quite often the federal government just thinks are left-wing greenies, to be frank about it, and don't pay too much attention to it. I think Beyond Net Zero has done a very good job of being in the middle there and trying to come up with really concrete ideas. And I think what I was just trying to point out was we need to go to the next level. So we actually need to say, and really this is a failure of government policy, right? So you would hope that governments would actually be driving an entire, at the state and federal level, an entire national agenda to transform the economy over the next 20 years. What are we going to do to create a highly prosperous economy? Now, to be fair, there are elements of that. I mean, the government's talking about a technology roadmap, it's talking about a hydrogen plan, but the details are just not there, and the real commitment to drive it really hard when you compare that to other economies who are very focused on transitioning. That, I think, is the challenge.
Thanks, Martijn. There was a question from Louis in the chat about how do we handle the big media opposition that we're up against. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so so basically we're talking about the likes of News Corp and Alan Jones and the like, who
yes,
who basically are probably worse than the politicians in many ways because they come up with the agenda and drive the politicians. So I think one thing is that is very important is that, I know the Climate Council has been very active in this. Every time somebody writes something in the paper that's just simply not true, write into the paper and holding them to account. Actually holding the individual journalist to account as saying something wrong. But then also just working very hard through community groups to put out what the truth is. because ultimately I think that propaganda, if you push back very hard, then I think ultimately if it's allowed to go on without being contested, it's where it gets a life. If you tend to basically contest it, then I think people start to back down. And I know that a lot of work has been done by a lot of activists one-on-one with individual journalists to get them to change their mind, to understand where they're wrong and just demonstrate facts. I mean, I had a discussion the other day with somebody about the Australian Energy Market Operator, ISP, their Integrated Services Plan, which talks about the transition in the Australian economy will not see a role for gas. And the comment that came back to me was, AEMO is a left-wing think tank. And I said, no, AEMO is the government's, is the energy market operator owned by government and industry to oversee the market. So, you know, just sometimes, and I remember once I had a discussion with a federal politician who I won't name, who was convinced that wind farms were run on diesel. So sometimes you really do need to overcome these challenges and just basically be very persistent.
Thanks, Martijn. And Andrew has a question.
Yeah, no, thank you, Martijn. That was fantastic. You really don't waste any words. It's just brilliant. Yeah, I just had a question about carbon pricing. So, one, CCL, we support a carbon fee and dividend.
Yep.
Do you see that as being the best form of carbon price? And two, it was interesting you mentioned Bob Carr had an emissions trading scheme. Is it possible for all the states to implement a carbon price and sort of leave the federal behind? Is that, like, legally, is that possible?
Yeah, so on your first question about the carbon dividend, just explain exactly what you mean.
Yeah, so we at CCL we support a carbon fee and dividend. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it basically plays a fee on carbon price, and that dividend is distributed equally to each citizen, sort of thing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, I guess in some ways that's what the CPRS did, but I mean, all the revenue raised was put back in. I mean, I think if you use a carbon price properly, you raise the money and then you direct it into other areas to decarbonise the economy. I mean, what the CPRS did is it gave citizens a certain amount of money to decrease energy pricing. But ultimately, I would say you're better off putting that money into far more into decarbonising the energy sector to have a rapid uptake of renewables and batteries and storage and transmission, etc., because that will bring the price down anyway. So I think that's a better way to do it. On your second question, sorry, what was the second question again? It
was about state versus federal.
Oh, yes, state versus federal. Yeah, so it's interesting. So the federal government has its powers to regulate climate change through its foreign affairs power under the Constitution. So they claim we've signed the Paris Agreement, that's an international agreement, therefore we can regulate anything really much on climate change. It was tricky about the ability to put in place a state-based scheme, but ultimately, in the absence of a federal scheme, then it was felt that tying an international electricity market, there was a way to do that. Interestingly, when the federal government had a renewable energy target, a number of states were looking at a state-based target, but felt for constitutional grounds that would be a conflict. But yes, the states could get together, they could do a state-based emissions trading scheme. There was a tremendous amount of work done on that. I think it was in 2009, from recollection. We did quite a bit of work on it at the time. But yes, they can. It's just the only reason that was given up was because the feds then moved back into doing the CPRS. So yes. There's another question there about Sweden announced it would divest of any Australian government bonds. That is true. So there's a number of sovereign wealth funds in Sweden that have said, because of Australia's policy on climate change, they will not invest in Australian government bonds. So that is correct. That question from Claudia. Yep.
Thank you, Claudia. And there was a question from Jeff asking about the role of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, potential role of CPLC in Australia.
Yeah, so I think, again, I mean, as I said at the outset, I think the really valuable thing about CPLC is that it gives you a tremendous amount of information about what's going on elsewhere in the world. And often I think, you know, one of the ways that when you talk to politicians is that when you can demonstrate why this is going on elsewhere and how it's working and how it's effective is a very powerful tool. Obviously in Australia, you know, the whole carbon pricing, carbon tax issue is very toxic, but nonetheless, the more we can demonstrate what other countries are doing and how it will make us uncompetitive in the future, I think is really important. And this is one of the key things, is that if Australia doesn't get a move on, it will be left behind. And if you take New South Wales government's bus procurement, it has a choice. It can either say we want to have all these electric buses, we can go and buy them all from China, and we can bring them in and away we go. Alternatively, we can say, okay, well, we can develop in Australia a whole process for assembling buses, building the batteries. We've got all the resources here which go into those batteries. We can process those batteries. We can build a manufacturing sector. A lot of it's automated, so the labour costs are not as significant. But we can build an economy around that and pull it all together, rather than getting all the constituent parts from overseas. So with a bit of vision, you can see that there's an ability to really turn around the economy through those sorts of policies.
Thank you. Rosie has a question, and then Simon.
Yeah, okay, so Rosie, your question about Angus Taylor's position on ARENA and the renewable energy funding bodies for gas and CCS. I mean, I can't comment whether that's likely, but the process for that to occur, if you were to change the mandate of ARENA or CFC, for example, to do other activities like that, it would require a change of the Act. So you'd actually have to change legislation. It would have to get through the House of Reps and the Senate, and attempts to do that in the past have not been successful. So, yeah, I mean, it really is a legislative process. I think that definitely Labor and the Greens would be would not allow that based on historical performance. And I'm not sure what the crossbenchers would do, but the thing is that even if they did that, right, let's be honest, CCS projects are very expensive. And so most of the private sector is not doing them anyway at the moment. I mean, they are getting cheaper, but that is a challenge in itself, just the cost of that. And secondly, gas, for all the reasons that people are divesting from gas, would be a challenge as well. So I think one needs to remember that organisations like the CFC are there to lend money and to get that money back and to make money. They're very unlikely to lend money to assets which they think will become stranded assets, or simply will not get their money back. ARENA is slightly different, but ARENA funds projects within a particular mandate. And again, those projects would have to be viable. So, I mean, I think in all of these, when you're spending public money, it's always very important to look at to look at the return on that money. At the same time, however, if a government decides it has a particular policy direction and wants to go in that direction, and it channels public money in that direction, that can often be a good thing. And the truth is that spending public money to date for ARENA and the CFC has actually accelerated the investment of renewables.
Thank you. Simon.
Hello, Martijn. Thanks very much for the nice talk. I've got two questions. One, quite quickly. We always tend to focus very much on the political, let's say, side of decarbonizing the economy, and fair enough. But I was wondering, from your perspective, what the main non-political obstacles are to decarbonizing the economy. So sorry, this is one question, the non-political obstacles. I've got another one, but from my wife. So I'm gonna take the baby and...
Hi, Martijn. I guess you mentioned environmental protection licenses as an existing model that could be potentially used for an emissions trading scheme. And I just wanted to know what elements of the EPL regime in New South Wales you were actually thinking about in borrowing that model for a broader regime for cap and trade or emissions trading.
Sure. Okay. So I'll deal with the second question first. I guess over the years we've looked at different things that could be adopted besides emissions trading to sort of regulate greenhouse gas emissions. So, and these are topics that have come up from time to time. So number one, and the challenge is always the fact is what's the role of the federal versus the state government. So one of the things on the federal government side, the state side, is the states have environmental protection acts. Under those acts, it's an offence to put waste into the environment or to cause air pollution. If you look at the real definition of waste and air pollution, one could argue that greenhouse gas emissions falls under that. The governments have not gone that far, but it's certainly the case in New South Wales. Secondly, we also have EPA licenses, which allow you to permit, and in the past, you've seen the Northern Territory in licenses with people like Impex require them to offset a certain amount of emissions under their licenses. WA talked about that recently, and the policy got reversed. But that's a mechanism to do it. You also have load-based licensing as well, and so having that load-based licensing is also something that can be done. So, there are ways. I mean, I believe that both in all the states we looked at, Victoria, New South Wales, that the state-based legislation to regulate pollution, you can argue that greenhouse gas emissions falls under that. In terms of the non-political obstacle, I think the main non-political obstacle really that exists in sort of transitioning is one, risk, investment risk, and two, technology risk. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. So at the moment, in Australia, we have an energy system that has traditionally run on large coal and gas plants, all linked together by transmission lines. Very stable system, all operates in synchronicity, the power's always on. Over the last few years, we've started to plug in a whole lot of wind and solar into that system. It becomes increasingly unstable. There are challenges about making sure the supply balances. And what people don't appreciate about the energy system is that it runs on a frequency, and it has to be running at a particular frequency to operate. If you have big fluctuations in that frequency, the system goes out. So in order to accommodate that, we've developed batteries and storage. We've been very successful at doing that, and governments like Victoria and others are doing that. We're looking at things like the Snowy Mountain scheme to create a big battery. We're looking at pump storage around Australia, and it's all going in the right direction, and we're looking at other transmission lines. But one of the other problems is, therefore, there's a lot of uncertainty as to how quickly that will be fixed. And another problem, for example, is that in many areas where you're putting wind and solar, the transmission lines to move that around the country are constrained. So if, for example, I build a solar farm and I want to take it from point A to point B, and there's a transmission line, and I build a solar farm, and I know I can produce a certain amount of energy and get it down that line and sell it, I can do an economic model for my plant, and I know I get a return, and I can make an investment. All of a sudden, 3 other solar farms come along, they attach that line, I can now only sell 60% of that electricity, and all of a sudden my economic model is thrown out. And then the regulator comes along, as they did recently, and said the regulator has a determination as to how much electricity is lost when you transport it, and that comes off how much you can sell in your calculation. They turned around recently and in many of those lines increased that loss factor by 20%. So all of a sudden, if I previously had a solar farm that could put power down a line, and I'm suddenly find out that there's 3 competitors on the line because anyone can get access, that the regulators decreased the amount I can sell through a formula, my entire financial model's out and I go broke. So the risk of the transition is very high, and these are issues that everybody is trying to resolve and resolve very well, but I think it's that risk. The second risk is just technology risk. People are afraid to try a lot of new technologies, and there's often a fear for that. And then that comes with cost. So the best example of this, and again, this is an example from the work we've done at ARENA, was if you go back 5 years, there were no very large solar power stations in Australia, because no one knew how to build them, no one knew how to get the panels cheaply, no one knew how to put them together. There were all these concerns about it. So ARENA ran a reverse auction process. And the other thing was, no Australian bank would give you a loan for more than 5 years for a renewables project. So ARENA ran a process which was a reverse auction process, inviting people to come forward with big proposals, and if you had a good proposal, we would fund you, and the more cost competitive it was, then you were more likely to get funding, and the top 10 cheapest plants got funding. And what happened was a lot of international developers came in, a lot of EPC contractors who build the plants came in, a lot of international banks came in and offered 15-year loans, and all of a sudden the price dropped by 5-fold, right? So again, that process removed technology risk. It showed it could be done. It brought in better financing. So it's all about, getting the market moving and getting through that first threshold. And sorry, and just one other really good example of this. Many years ago, I chaired an organisation called Low Carbon Australia, which was the precursor to CFC, and we handed out loans for energy efficiency. And there was an abattoir in Queensland where the CEO of the abattoir was very anti-carbon pricing and everything else like that. And one of the things he said was he came out very critical of the carbon price. Anyway, we convinced them to take a loan to do energy efficiency. They reduced their energy costs in 18 months by 50%. And he came out in the front of the paper and said, this is the most wonderful thing we've ever seen. Carbon pricing is great, et cetera, et cetera. The day after, we struggled to get any abattoir to pick that up. The day after he announced his success, we had 15 abattoirs contact us. So all about momentum, right? It's all about momentum and getting that understood. So there's just another question from Malcolm there about what relative value do I see in influencing local councils under climate emergency? I think that's a really good question. I think that it's of incredible value because number one, and my local council, which is in Warringah, which is in the Mossman Council, which is in Zali Segal's electorate, recently did it, and it's a traditionally very liberal council and very and it was quite a lot of work to get the councils aligned to get across the line. But it's all about, again, building momentum. And the day that we had that declaration, it was in the middle of the bushfires. The sky was red, the smoke was everywhere, and the front page of the Herald was climate emergency, and the council did it. So I think it's really important because you raise awareness, you get councils engaged, and then what happens is people start to think about what can we do to address the climate emergency. So the dialogue moves from having the emergency to what are the things that can be done within our council local area to do that. Brenda, I think you asked CFC, so I think that's a Clean Energy Finance Corporation. So that's the federal, so it's CEFC. I'm probably speaking too quickly. So it's the federal government's $10 billion bank, which gives loans for very large scale renewable energy projects.
We're nearly out of time, Martijn, but I think Philippa had a question that I think should perhaps be the last one.
Well, I kind of wrote in the chat, and it was just scanning the horizon for what you see could be game changers, just in the same way that the reverse auctions came in and really made a big difference. And I was just thinking that if you look across the horizon at what you've seen at the state and federal level, what are the minimum pieces you'd need to get up to be really making a difference? And then I guess how that fits with what people like us can do in our own local areas, linking with all of the range of things CCL already does.
Yeah, so I think at a big level, we have to think about this is a phenomenal opportunity to transform the nation. And quite often we have a lot of little projects, they might not actually be little, but if you take, for example, one good example is if you think really big, we've got the proposal for a second electricity cable between Tasmania and mainland Australia. That cable, if that cable was to run, or to have 2 or 3 of those cables, all of the hydro that goes on all night in Tassie could be run permanently, and it could bring more power in. If you think, okay, what else can we do alongside that? We can put alongside that large-scale telco cables, which can run data between Tasmania and Victoria. What else can we do? We can tie that electricity cable into all the offshore wind facilities off Victoria, put them all together, and then put that into Gippsland. We can start to rebuild Gippsland and that whole area as an economic decarbonisation zone. We can use all the electricity assets that are there. We can bring in manufacturing. We've got cheap energy. We can bring in hydrogen. So often it's about putting the pieces together that will transform, that will really transform the economy. I mean, that's a role for big thinking at a government level, but it's not that complicated, to be honest. I mean, some of the stuff in Australia that should happen, like a very fast train between Sydney and Melbourne. I mean, every other country in the world seems to be able to do this stuff, and we don't. So I think that basically thinking of some really big nation building projects, and the irony is the elements are there. So there are 4 companies at the moment who are building an electric supercharging highway from the top of Australia down to Melbourne into Adelaide. Well, 2 of them have gone to Adelaide, Northern Territory. The other 2 are coming down the coast. But you can already drive a Tesla and recharge it between Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane. So, you know, this stuff is moving, but people aren't aware of it. So I think one of the really important things, I mean, that's probably not so much for this group to do, but I think one of the most important things about this group to do is just to raise awareness. So when somebody says you can't do this, you say, well, it's actually already being done. And when a council says we can't do this, you say, yes, you can. So why can't a council put in electric vehicle charging stations all over the place? If you have a private sector operator wanting to do it, the council just needs to facilitate it. It doesn't cost them any money. So I think, you know, pushing back things all the time. I mean, sorry, Claudia, that's a funny comment about utopia. I do get the I do get the reality of that. But I think, you know, there are people like Ross Garno's, you know, a lot of this stuff isn't that difficult, and it's being done elsewhere in the world. So I'd put the very fast train in the utopia bucket. But some of the other stuff, I mean, if you just take as an example, the Snowy Mountain scheme, the Snowy Mountain will supply 50% of Australia's energy needs as a battery. I mean, it's a massive project. It will cost more, but I mean, so it's not necessarily entirely economic to build, but it is a big nation building project. So there's a lot of stuff on the table that can be done. And I think that's very important. Yeah, well, I think two things. Two things on the ABC. So one, a very good show that does have a big impact is Landline. So the more that you can get on, so I noticed Landline are doing a lot more on things like soil carbon, healthy farms. The more that can be done through Landline is really important. And then you're right. I mean, shows, and also the shows like The Business, which is the former Late Line, they're increasingly focused on businesses that do stuff like this, and that's really important. So it's often simply feeding these stories to journalists at the ABC and getting them driven. So there are people like there's Adam Morton at The Guardian, there's the ABC journalists who are all very keen for this story. And then I think just constantly lobbying them to bring in something back like the science show or Catalyst is very important. Yep. Well, I think just basically, so number one, easy to say, lobbying ABC to bring shows like that back, but also I think feeding stories. So what happens is, even if Catalyst doesn't come back, through things like Radio National and just feeding journalists stories on things, they're always looking for interesting stories. And the other thing I've noticed is that if a particular issue is going on and they've got a politician on who they're interviewing, they often want material to counter what they're saying. Q&A is another good example. Like, they often want people who can give counter views on things. So the more information that can be sent to, I mean, just writing to a journalist saying, look, I've noticed this, you should do a story on it, and just trying to get things out would be very useful, I think.
Martijn, you've been very generous with your time, and thank you so much for such boundless information. We're so glad to have you on board, and we look forward to working quite a bit more with you on CPLC and other things. And you've given us so many ideas of things that we can do as individuals and as individual chapters out in the community, but also as a national body. So we'll be mining this recording for weeks to come, and considering what sorts of ways we can use this, but also what ways we can work with you more, because clearly you're a very important player in this area, and we're very pleased to be now closely linked with you, and looking forward to an ongoing powerful relationship.
No worries, it's a pleasure.